Arguing against the minimum wage law, Don Boudreaux is a senior fellow with the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He's also a Mercatus Center board member and a professor of economics at George Mason University. He specializes in globalization and trade, law and economics, and antitrust economics. You can find his writings in the pages of the Wall Street Journal, the U.S. News and World Report, as well as on his blog, Cafe Hayek. Please welcome Don Boudreaux. Each of our debaters will have 10 minutes for opening arguments, followed by 7 for rebuttal, and finally 4 minutes of closing argument before we open up the conversations to questions from you all in our audience. With that, Mike Consul. Oh, Don Boudreaux.
Thanks, Dov. I'm told that they're going to be very strict in time, so I'll get right to it. I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to be in the same event as Mike. Thanks to Matt and to all of you who made this possible. Let me begin with 3 prefatory remarks. First, I trust that everyone here shares the goal of having low-skilled workers paid incomes as high as possible, with no one forced into the ranks of the unemployed or obliged to suffer other negative consequences. That is the value judgment that I carry with me throughout tonight's discussion and in every discussion that I have about the minimum wage. Second, my main concern is for the well-being of low-skilled workers. My assessment of the minimum wage turns overwhelmingly on how well or how poorly it is likely to benefit such workers. Only secondarily do I care about the effects on employers or investors or consumers. You might disagree with my conclusions. I'm certain many of you will, but that disagreement will be over predicted consequences and not over values or goals. Third, my principal purpose here is to try to persuade you of the reasonableness of the standard economic case that the minimum wage harms some of its intended beneficiaries. I recognize that the minimum wage also helps some people by raising their wages. Although analyzing this trade-off isn't my main purpose, I will say a few words about it near the end of these remarks. I choose this as my main purpose because the principal case for the minimum wage, the case for it that's almost always made, is that it raises all low-skilled workers' wages and incomes without harming any of them. It's this case that I believe to be most clearly incorrect. Until and unless all politicians and pundits who support the minimum wage concede the possibility that it harms some low-skilled workers, I believe that the public discussion is flawed and misleading. So I do oppose minimum wages. I oppose them chiefly because economics tells me that by raising employers' cost of employing low-skilled workers, the minimum wage makes the employment of these workers less attractive and thus destroys jobs for some of these workers. And losing jobs means not only losing income, but also losing opportunities to gain valuable work experience. The result is unintended harm to some, and perhaps many, low-skilled workers. In addition, the effects of the minimum wage, both positive and negative, aren't distributed randomly. By reducing the number of jobs for low-skilled workers, while simultaneously drawing into the workforce other workers, housewives, retirees, college students, drawn in by the higher minimum wage, it makes the pool of workers competing for these jobs larger. The risk is real that those workers who get and keep jobs at the higher minimum wage are workers who need higher incomes the least, and the workers who do not get jobs, who are denied jobs, are workers who need any incomes the most. Choosing from a larger pool of applicants for a smaller number of jobs, employers are too likely, too often, to choose the safe applicant. The recent immigrant, the single mom, the inner-city minority teen will be overlooked. That's what happens when employers can become more choosy, when the number of jobs shrinks and the number of workers competing for those jobs rises. So let me explain a little bit more clearly my worries. The potential for the minimum wage to destroy jobs for low-skilled workers is the effect most feared by economists. I believe that this fear is justified. The classic economic argument for the minimum wage rests on the central pillar of modern economics, the law of demand. You get rid of that law of demand, you get rid of its validity, you get rid of modern economics. Some people might think that's good. I make my living as an economist. I think it would be bad. The law of demand says that if the cost of taking any action rises, people will take that action less frequently. Importantly, this law lies not only at the heart of economics, it's a proposition that every one of us takes as a practical rule of reality every day. For example, many environmentalists want to tax carbon emissions because they correctly understand that such a tax reduces carbon emissions. Many conservatives oppose such a tax because they correctly understand that that tax will reduce the industrial activities that cause carbon emissions. Many skeptics of globalization want a Tobin tax on short-term currency speculation because they correctly understand that such a tax will reduce such speculation. By the very same logic, a government-imposed requirement that employers raise the pay of low-skilled workers will make the employment of such workers less attractive and thus destroy jobs for at least some of those workers. Indeed, the minimum wage works as a tax on the employment of low-skilled workers. To employ such workers, firms must pay more. The fact that the additional payment goes to the workers rather than to the government is in this case irrelevant. From the employer's perspective, it's a mandated extra payment, a tax, for every hour of low-skilled workers employed. So if a Tobin tax reduces short-term currency speculation, if taxing carbon emissions reduces carbon emissions, why will taxing firms for employing low-skilled workers not reduce the amount of low-skilled work that they employ? My understanding of reality is that it will reduce the number of low-skilled workers who have jobs. Almost all economists until 20 years ago opposed the minimum wage because they feared these employment consequences. This opposition was supported not only by economic theory, but also by empirical research, perhaps the most famous instance of which was the 1981 Minimum Wage Study Commission report, which found that roughly a 10% increase in the minimum wage caused about a 3% reduction in teenage unemployment, teenagers being a proxy for low-skilled workers. That was the consensus until the mid-90s. In the mid-90s, a new wave of empirical research commenced, much of which finds that minimum wage hikes have indeed no negative employment effects. This new research has undone, it must be said, the pre-1990 consensus among economists. However, it hasn't yet convinced the majority of economists that the classic prediction of job losses is wrong. 1 year ago this month, the University of Chicago released the results of a survey that it took of 42 top economists, including 2 Nobel laureates, Angus Deaton and Eric Maskin. These economists were asked to agree or disagree with the following proposition, and I'm quoting now. If the federal minimum wage is raised gradually to $15 per hour by 2020, the employment rate for low-wage U.S. workers will be substantially lower than it would be under the status quo, end quote. A plurality, 25% of the surveyed economists agreed with this proposition. Some even did so strongly. That was a survey option. But it was close. 24% disagreed, although none disagreed strongly. 38% were uncertain. Others didn't vote on that issue. In other words, slightly more of the surveyed economists last year agreed than disagreed that this size hike in the minimum wage will shrink substantially the employment prospects of low-skilled workers. That survey question, though, asked about a very large increase in the minimum wage. What about one closer to the one now proposed for California, a 50% rise from $10 in California to $15? A 2013 survey, also by Chicago, also of the same prominent economists and same Nobel Prize winners, asked the following question. Raising the federal minimum wage to $9 per hour would make it noticeably harder for low-skilled workers to find employment. That's a 24% rise, by the way, from $7.25 to $9. Here also a plurality, 34% agreed that even a 24% rise in the minimum wage would make it noticeably more difficult for low-skilled workers to find jobs. In neither of these surveys are a majority of economists persuaded by the new minimum wage research, a fact that tells me, at the very least, that the jury in this question is still out, or more plausibly, that economists still, correctly, largely agree that minimum wages have negative employment effects. I'm with those economists who agree that the minimum wage, rising even modestly, hurts many low-skilled workers. The reason is not because I reject empirical evidence. I don't. Instead, the reason is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and it's an extraordinary claim that the standard prediction of the law of demand does not hold in one market, that is, the market for low-skilled workers.
So while there are indeed some recent studies that find that minimum wages don't destroy jobs, what you'll miss if you get your information today from most news sources and blogs is that there's also a lot of evidence, in fact, even more evidence, much of it very recent, that minimum wages do in fact destroy jobs to many low-skilled workers. David Newmark from UC Irvine and William Washer are today perhaps the most prominent contributors to this anti-minimum wage research. Here's their book. It's a 2008 book published by MIT Press, cleverly entitled Minimum Wages. They supply here an exhaustive survey of the empirical literature. By their count, 2/3 of the empirical studies find job losses. Their survey of the empirical literature leads them to this conclusion, and here I'm quoting from page 287 of their book. Summary of evidence: minimum wages reduce employment of low-skilled workers. Strength of conclusion: fairly unambiguous. A handful of studies find positive effects, some find no effect, but the preponderance of evidence points clearly to negative effects. Of course, they could be wrong. They might be mistaken. My point here is not to defend their conclusion so much as it is to emphasize the fact that the empirical literature on the effects of the minimum wage does not contain extraordinary evidence against the standard proposition that raising the cost of employing low-skilled workers will result in fewer of those workers being employed. So if the case that raising the minimum wage even might destroy jobs for some of the workers that it's meant to help, what right have we to embark upon this policy? I think none. Remember, the people whose livelihoods are here being experimented with are low-skilled workers. They aren't doctors, lawyers, machinists, welders, or college professors. They're motel maids, fast food workers, teens just entering the workforce. If minimum wage proponents are correct that no jobs are destroyed, then these workers are indeed benefited without cost to them. Although here, there's a question of who pays the cost of these workers' gains, and what is the moral reason for imposing that cost on those persons. For example, if we all agree that all low-skilled workers should be given raises, what's the moral justification for requiring only current employers of low-skilled workers to pay these costs? Why not pay these workers raises out of general revenues collected as taxes from the tax-paying population? It's a question that I think should be asked, but it is seldom asked. But what if basic economics and the bulk of the empirical studies are correct and minimum wage proponents are incorrect? We then have a policy that not only prices some willing workers out of jobs, and again, also out of opportunities to get job experience, which helps these people to get even higher wages in the future, but a policy that also distributes the bulk of its benefits to those who need those benefits the least, while it inflicts the bulk of its costs on those who can least afford such burdens.
Don Boudreaux, thank you very much.
One more paragraph. Yeah. Even apart from the randomness of the distribution of such costs and benefits, what moral case is there for enabling some people to earn higher wages by pricing other people out of the labor market to earn no wages? I think none. Thank you.
Thank you.